I jump in real quick?
No.
Just because I know this is one of the questions, but I think it's good to nail down now. One of the biggest voices, and we talked about this a couple weeks ago, in this generation is Gary V. Gary Vaynerchuk, huge
Late
entrepreneur,
30s, major entrepreneur.
just and we talked about this because the funny thing is, if you watch enough of his stuff, if you can get past his language, um, at the end of the day, he's talking about self-awareness, but he has no idea how to frame it.
Right.
And I think it speaks to the question that Olivia brought up, is that from a biblical perspective, there's a difference between personhood and individualism, which is what a lot of us millennials seek for, that entrepreneurial spirit, that wanting to be recognized. So I think it's a good point here to maybe interject. What is the difference between personhood and wanting to be recognized as an individual person, and what the culture would say is success?
Great question as well. So let's go back to Gary Vee and self-awareness. The reality is you cannot be self-aware without being other-aware. And you can't be other-aware unless you really want to become a person. And in a culture that's gone from, well, let's go back to Abraham Maslow's self-actualization, Carl Rogers on being a person, on becoming a person, Rollo May on our question for being. All of those things, they started Saybrook Graduate School. I got my psychology degree at Saybrook, so I sat at the feet of their disciples. And I wanted to understand secular humanistic thought and self-actualization. Not because I wanted to abandon theology, but because I wanted to understand, how do we understand the culture? And ironically, when I get there, I discover that Carl Rogers, who is the premier founder, along with Abraham Maslow and Rollo May, all abandoned their faith traditions and rejected Christianity or Judaism because they were shut down, and Carl Rogers wrote his book on being a person. I had to study him in college before I even got to grad school. And what he's really talking about is being an individual. Carl Rogers was raised in a strict evangelical fundamentalist home in Chicago. His father was a successful entrepreneur and businessman, but his message of Christianity was don't smoke or chew or go with those that do. So it was a negative thing, and Carl was never allowed to be Carl growing up, so he was never listened to by his mother and father. So he rejected Christianity, and though he wanted to please his father, because that was the way the culture was, it was a very patriarchal culture, and his father was very demanding, but his father never engaged him, so he never fit in. He never felt like he fit into his family. So he, in his first essay, in his book on becoming a person, he tells this whole story. So imagine being raised in the world of where Billy Sunday was the premier evangelist of American evangelism, and hellfire and brimstone and don't smoke or chew or go with those that do, and your father becomes this staunch, hard, concretized, fundamentalist evangelical who even though he works in the big city of Chicago, he has a hobby farm outside so that you don't get to hang out in the city and do all the bad things. You've got to live on the farm and have, all the kids have to be isolated from the world that everybody else is living in, which only creates more of a desire to be in that world. And so he rebels against his parents, and the first sign of his rebellion back then was he married a woman out of the faith. So he marries a woman out of the faith, and then his father yet demands that he goes to seminary. So he decides to go to the most liberal seminary on the East Coast, which at the time was New York Theological Seminary, and he's there for a year, and he doesn't want to do it. And he has the guts enough to say to his father, I'm not called to the ministry. Which I wish a whole lot of guys today would have the guts to be honest enough to say, because there's bishops in the bishopric, there are preachers in the ministry that have no belief whatsoever in this and really shouldn't even be call themselves Christians. And I can name a bunch of the liberal voices that really have, all they want to do is destroy the faith. And so that's a whole set. But Rogers had the integrity enough to say, I'm not going to do this. So he begins to study psychology, existential psychology, and all those things. And when he talks about the non-directive approach to therapy. He's basically saying, even though I'm the therapist and I've got all this training, I don't have all the answers for my client. So I'm not going to set the agenda. I'm going to listen to what the client is saying, because only the client can tell me what they're wrestling with. And that non-directive approach, which was tied to positive self-regard, is all rooted in the fact that he had Bible-thumping fundamentalist parents that never listened to him. And now today, the reason we are even listening is because somebody who walked away from Christ has taught us how to listen to people and hear their pain. So that's and yet what he was endorsing was not on becoming a person, but on becoming an individual.
Right.
Because having rejected evangelicalism, he unconsciously also rejected what in orthodoxy is a relationship with the divine persons. Person is a theological construct, not a psychological one.
Right.
And so you can't be a person without the persons who created us in their image and likeness. And so he rejected that. So what he's really, as brilliant as Rogers is, it's really seductive, because what he's telling us is how to become an individual. And so real quick, if we go back now, where does all that come from? Well, a Greek philosopher named Democritus was the father of science, and he was the one that developed atomic theory based on his mentor. So atoms are the smallest substance of the universe. So every atom is an individual atom. So ultimately, evolutionary theory and everything else comes out of a Greek idea that all we are is individual substance. So to be an individual is to be a biological particle of matter as the least indivisible part of nature. So we're individuals. That's not a person.
Right.
And so that led to individualism eventually, and to where we are now, where we end up thinking we're the ultimate authority.